of Parliamentary Budget Officer referred to the committee on Monday, March 9th, 2026. I would like to welcome our witness, Ms. Annette Ryan, the Deputy Director, Partnership Policy and Analysis for FinTrack, who has been nominated by the government to be the next Parliamentary Budget Officer. I would now like to give you the floor for your opening remarks for 5 minutes. Please go ahead, Ms. Ryan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Cher Vice-Président et honorable membre du comité.
Vice Presidents and honorable members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to present my candidacy for the position of Parliamentary Budget Officer of Canada.
Leaders, in particular Senator Hugh Segal and the Honorable Paul Dewar, who advocated diligently for many years to create the independent Parliamentary Budget Office. Their goal was to deepen the transparency and accountability of Canadian governments to their Parliament and to Canadians. Informed parliamentary scrutiny is foundational to delivering real results for Canadians and core to the health of our democracy.
I would also like to begin by expressing my deep respect for all my predecessors who built the office of the Budget Director. As has been widely noted, the OECD recently recognized the Parliamentary Budget Officer's office as the best in the world, a highly effective source of independent and credible advice. The same OECD report offered balanced recommendations to guide its next steps.
OECD recommendations, and I commit to deepen and strengthen PBO attention to the sustainability of the government's overall fiscal track. I will also extend PBO attention to how government budget proposals are executed as they flow through to main and supplementary estimates and into public accounts. This is core to parliamentary business, and it's also core to the practical question of what return Canadians get on the investment of taxes raised from them and in their name. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Annette Ryan, and I am a proud Atlantic Canadian. I was raised on a family farm in Newfoundland and then in Prince Edward Island. I served as a page in the House of Commons. That was during the original Canada-U.S. free trade debates. In 1988, I'm 55. You don't need to do the math. I earned a mathematics degree from Acadia University in Nova Scotia and a master's in economics from Oxford University, which I attended on a Rhodes Scholarship. I started my professional career at the Institute for Fiscal Studies in London, UK, where I learned to analyze complex data sets to inform pressing economic and fiscal questions: productivity, innovation, wages, employment. I then made a specific decision in 1996 to return to Canada, to my local community and family, to work at the Prince Edward Island Provincial Treasury, where I managed all aspects of transfer payments and income taxes. While I am an anywhere person by training, I am a somewhere person by choice.
Rather than listing my professional titles or the projects I've managed over the past 3 decades, I'll describe my experience in terms of the ministers I have supported.
Minister Chevery in the Liberal government of Catherine Colbeck, Minister Mella in the Conservative government of Pat Binns. At the federal level, Monsieur le Premier Ministre,
the Prime Minister Chrétien,
Prime Minister Harper, Minister Baird, Minister Taves, Minister Clement, Monsieur le Ministre Paradis,
Minister Paradis,
Minister Polyev, Minister Mihaichuk, Minister Haidu, Monsieur le Ministre Duclos,
Minister Duclos,
Minister Freeland, Monsieur le Ministre Leblanc,
Minister Leblanc, and currently Minister Champagne.
Today, I am seeking your approval of a mandate so that I may put my expertise at your service.
I intend to provide you with high-quality, independent, and relevant analysis so that you can hold the Prime Minister, his ministers, and senior officials to account on questions like, can we afford these budget proposals? Are plans robust to higher oil prices, higher interest rates, recession? Who is responsible to execute on commitments? Quel est le retour sur...
What is the return on investment for these proposals? Before concluding, I'd like to briefly revisit the issue of the office's independence, which is fundamental to its credibility.
The Act currently allows a second term for the Parliamentary Budget Officer. I commit today to be a one-term PBO. I believe there are certain accountability roles in the senior public service that should not be eligible for reappointment in the interest of maintaining the integrity and independence 100% beyond reproach. And I believe the Parliamentary Budget Officer is such a role. To
protect the independence of the office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, I will decline a second term.
And I want the trust of Canadians. And I want the government to have a clear timeline to appoint my successor. You have my word that I will serve you to the very best of my ability without seeking favor or influence. Merci. Thank you. J'ai hâte de répondre à vos questions.
I look forward to answering your questions.
We will begin now with 6 minutes from Mr. Hillan, please.
I just want to start today by thanking Jason Jakes for his service as PBO. He upheld the integrity and independence of the office he held as the PBO. He did a tremendous job holding the government to account and providing vital information to parliamentarians. We are disappointed that he was not nominated as the permanent PBO, as we outlined in the Conservatives' letter to the Prime Minister. Ms. Ryan, thank you for being here. Given the PBO's mandate in the Parliament of Canada Act, including the...
Or what the hell?
Thank you for being here. Given the PBO's mandate in the Parliament of Canada Act, including the Statement of Independence on the PBO website, will you commit to being impartial and transparent if you are the PBO?
I absolutely commit to being independent and transparent, impartial.
Thank you. The PBO works for Parliament, not the Prime Minister or any government. Will you commit to maintaining full independence from the executive branch and working for parliamentarians representing Canadians?
I do indeed.
Thank you. As it's been reported, you were at Oxford during the same time as the Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Just given your past relationship, how can Canadians be assured you will uphold the impartiality and independence of the PBO office if you become permanent?
Thank you for that question right off the top. I've seen the discussion of my past acquaintanceship with the Prime Minister. I took a 2-year Masters of Economics program at Oxford University. The Prime Minister was already there. He was in the year previous to me. As Canadians, we knew each other in the program and so on, but had different social circles and so on. I saw him again in a professional capacity when I was chief economist at Industry Canada, and he was governor of the Bank of Canada. I supported a committee at the time of roughly 20 deputy ministers who would meet on a regular basis to discuss economic matters. During that time, I would discuss agenda questions, topics that the deputies might pose to him in those meetings. I typically dealt with his office rather than the governor himself. And so I would say that was really where our professional paths crossed. I would also add, just for your comfort, that even though we had positive and professional engagements anytime we met, I did not have any contact with him after he left to become governor of the Bank of England.
Thank you, Ms. Ryan, for clearing that up. Will you commit to never censoring or watering down a report at the request of the government, bureaucracy, or Prime Minister's office?
I am very comfortable in making that commitment.
Thank you. The reason for these questions are obviously, as you said, they've been reported. They've been out there in the news. Also, just given the track record of this government, as an example, Mr. Jakes called out the government on the fiscal situation framing as, quote, standing at the precipice and looking out over the cliff, unquote. He raised concerns about the government's debt to GDP ratio, deficits, and the housing targets. In return, he was not reappointed. And we've seen this pattern from the Liberal government before. For people who speak out against them, they get dismissed, and see a clear example with former Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould when she spoke against power. If you get put in a situation such as that, where you're being pressured by the government to be quiet, will you still speak out?
I am seeking the role of Parliamentary Budget Officer, which is independent of the government and has as its core mandate to serve parliamentarians. I would see you collectively as my boss. I think that the key of that role is to provide you with exactly that pointy analysis that I look forward to building relationships and listening to you as to your priorities and figuring out the best way to support you with, not just crunchy analytical papers, but also that sense of what are the key issues in terms of fiscal sustainability and the execution of budget commitments. That's why I'm here. I think we're very aligned, and I look forward to operating just the way you described.
Right. I appreciate the answer, just because given the track record of this government, I just wanted to see where you would be at if you were put in a position where you had to speak out against power. We've seen what happens with the Liberal government when that happens. That person is dismissed. What would do you have some steps you would take if you were being asked to be quiet, or at a risk of reprimand?
I think that in as much as I see the role as serving Parliament, it is not the role of the government to provide reprimand to the extent that they can have differing views about the nature of my analysis. I very much welcome that. That is very much the tradition that I came up in. I believe in building out the analysis of the PBO with full transparency to support exactly that discussion.
Yeah. I think I have about 20 seconds. I'll save my questions for the next round. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Hallan. On va continuer avec Monsieur Létard maintenant pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Ms. Ryan, and thank you for being there. And thank you for going through this procedure. Of course, we appreciate what the role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer entails. As you said, it's an independent organization which reports to Parliament and not to a minister in particular. We're very aware of that, and also we are aware of the usefulness of an office like the Parliamentary Budget Officer's Office. Now, you spoke to your experience and of your expertise in this field. And you also spoke to the recent OECD report. Perhaps you can elaborate a little more on how you will ensure that what is unveiled in a budget will actually be implemented. I think that's very important. So perhaps you can speak to that a little more, how you see that aspect of your role. Thank you very much for your question. Well, I worked in the 3 central agencies, finance and the CRA, and its equivalent on PEI. I'm very familiar with the budget process and with the estimates process. And I see the link between what is announced in a budget and authorized in the estimates process. So to come back to your question, it's a matter of how to follow up on commitments made in the budget on Budget Day throughout the rest of the financial year and the following years as well. I might question departments on major projects or ongoing programs, on critical paths or implementation plans before or during the estimates process to see how things will actually unfold and whether expectations and deadlines are met. Thank you. Does this mean that you might follow up a little more closely along with Treasury Board? I think it's necessary to do that, to conduct that type of analysis. As I said, I've worked for the Treasury Board Secretariat. I manage the expense research team. I built a database system which followed the money in the budget through the authorities and the public accounts. I think it's possible to enhance that type of accountability through AI. Thank you very much. Now, on another topic, this is very current, and Canada's not the only country dealing with this situation. The world is changing constantly, and in fact, the traditional order is changing. And you said you were there at the beginning of the free trade negotiations, and the world that existed back then was a rules-based order which everybody understood. But today, well, there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, this, of course, has an impact on economic forecasts or projections of a government. And on the evolution, if you will, of a budget and revenues. So in this kind of new environment, again, with a high degree of uncertainty and variability, unprecedented variability, how do you see your role as Parliamentary Budget Officer? Do you see your role as not only analyzing the situation, but also making recommendations to the government in light of everything happening in the world today and the effect of this on energy prices and a possible looming world recession? So how do you see your role and your advice function in this world? Well, it is the role of the Parliamentary Budget Officer to provide advice on the nature of analysis of budgets and the projects you've mentioned would lead to solutions. If the grants and contributions, I'm sorry, perhaps you can complete your answer later on. Thank you very much, Détao. We'll continue with the block for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Ms. Ryan for being here. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Jakes, the former Parliamentary Budget Officer. He and his entire team, we often forget that there's a huge team behind the Parliamentary Budget Officer. In fact, in this case, it's a small team that does a huge amount of work. So I'd like to take a moment to thank them all and how much we appreciate their work. So, Parliamentary Budget Officer is well known. The Conservatives know this. We know this. We've asked questions about the nomination process. We had asked for the reappointment of Mr. Jakes, and And this, of course, has nothing to do with the quality of your own candidacy, your resume, your experience. I read your resume, and there is no doubt that you are highly competent. And that was the case for Mr. Jakes as well. The Prime Minister himself had appointed him and found him very competent and thought he was the right person for the job. And a few weeks later, the Minister of Finance undermined the credibility of Mr. Jakes and said he was not the right person for the job, and that Kevin Page, comparisons were made with Kevin Page. So how would you say that you are competent compared to him? Well, let me restate my deep respect for Jason Jakes and Yves Giroux and, of course, Kevin Page, who were the predecessors in this office. As for the independence of the analysis, in face of resistance of the government, if the government doesn't like what the PBO is saying, I feel that transparency is one of the main approaches I will take to manage this office. We have a huge network of economists here in Canada. There are many economists in the world, and I will call on the expertise of the team of the PBO to have a good debate on discrepancies in analysis if that happens. To keep the government's attention focused on these issues. Thank you, Ms. Ryan. You said something which I thought was very interesting. You said, I will only serve one mandate. I will not seek a second mandate. This really caused me to reflect, because you've worked in the machinery of government at various levels. You held many positions. Your loyalty and your integrity have never been questioned. And as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, you might be called to criticize some government policies. Do you commit not to work for government again after the end of your mandate? Well, that's really important as a question. Well, I haven't thought of that. I'll think about it and I can come back to you. Sure, if you can give us a written answer, it could be yes or no. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. But since you're the one who broached this topic, I think the question is relevant. We saw a report from the OECD on the Parliamentary Budget Officer's office. The OECD spoke highly of the PBO, but said that the position had been vacant for a bit and that this undermined the integrity of the office. Why do you think the government wants to replace Mr. Jakes if the work he had done was so good? It seems that if you have someone who's good, you keep them in place. Isn't that how it's supposed to work in government? I think it's better if you put that question to the government itself. There was a competition. I applied. I can speak of my candidacy. No, I understand. I understand your answer. Thank you. The former PBOs were people who were in the media. They spoke to the public. They were good communicators. Mr. Fréchette, Mr. Page. The last two PBOs were good communicators with the public, and they explained government policy. So how would you see your relationship with Canadians? Well, that's an excellent question. My priority is to report to Parliament. However, I think it's also important that the analysis be well understood by the public. And I don't think there's a conflict amongst these two things. I am looking forward to defending the PBO's analyses before Parliament and also through the media, if that's relevant. The Minister of Transport today, during question period, said that we are facing an economic apocalypse. What do you think of that wording? Well, I will do my best to not use hyperbolic language. I will speak to you through scenarios and analyses which are clear and which are based on the current circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Caron. We'll start with Mr. Lefebvre for 5 minutes. Ms. Ryan, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. I would also like to say a few words about Jason Jakes, who really did a huge amount of work in the last year, the last few months, as the Parliamentary Budget Officer. The definition of the Parliamentary Budget Officer is someone who's nonpartisan, neutral, and independent. The Parliamentary Budget Officer assists, helps, supports members of Parliament and senators in their work, and Mr. Jakes did so in an exemplary way in the last few months. He was very competent. And to follow up on what my colleague just said, I've worked in the private sector, and it's the same with our employees here in government. When you have a competent person who meets all the criteria, you hang on to them. So through you, Madam Chair, I was a little surprised to see that the government did not want to renew Mr. Jason Jakes' mandate. Maybe because Mr. Jakes showed courage. Relevance, Mr. Lefebvre? Can you please ask relevant questions of the witness? Yes, I'm getting to my question, Madam Chair. So Mr. Jakes showed courage by denouncing a certain type of management when some fiscal anchors were abandoned. Are you going to show the same type of courage when the government will, for instance, remove fiscal anchors which had been considered catastrophic for Canada's finances? Will you have the courage to speak directly? Well, I have a few answers to that question. First, I have a huge degree of respect for Jason, and as I said in my opening statement, I fully intend to continue analyzing the fiscal situation, the budgetary framework, and I will add different types of analyses to monitor other fiscal anchors. For instance, what is the proportion of expenditures versus revenues, and how would that affect the debt? There are different ways of tackling this and tackling debts and the deficit. I have the courage to continue that work. Now, as for the part of your question which was to choose me, again, I think that's a question best put to the government. Thank you very much. At the beginning, you said that you wanted to win the trust of elected officials, and I appreciate that. You also said in your opening remarks that you have an interesting relationship because you were at Oxford at the same time that Mr. Carney was there. Can you explain to Canadians and reassure them that you will indeed be neutral when you interact with the government? I think the better way to answer your question is to point to my 3 decades of work within the Canadian government. I served both Liberal and Conservative governments. In fact, for 15 years, I worked under Conservative governments, and for 15 years under Liberal governments. I know a lot of people on both sides of the House, and I served for 3 decades without being influenced. I can provide you with more details. I don't know how else to convince you other than beginning the work with integrity and neutrality. Well, I have a question which has to go with the independent nature of your office. You said that you only want to serve one mandate, and I'd like to thank you for stating that, and so that your successor will know when he or she will begin. Do you believe the government made a mistake by not planning for the succession of the next Parliamentary Budget Officer? Brief answer, please. Well, I applied for the job in December of 2025, and as for the deadline, it's a question for the government.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to Ms. Ryan. Ms. Ryan, over the past number of months here at committee, we've been discussing a lot of budget-related items, fiscal sustainability, affordability for Canadians, financial sector resilience, and just in general, the policies supporting government's programs. And obviously, these discussions have underscored the importance of credible and nonpartisan economic analysis to guide us in our decision-making. So given your extensive background, over 30 years you laid out in advising governments, how do you feel that your approach as the Parliamentary Budget Officer can be objective and evidence-based and enable Parliament to make key decisions?
Thank you, Mr. MacDonald. I think I'll answer this question in going back in time a little bit. So I started with the Prince Edward Island Provincial Treasury in 1996, which was essentially the last time Canada hit a fiscal wall. So at the time, Canada was paying roughly 35 cents of every revenue dollar in debt charges. And it was threatening our credit rating, and the government of the day, the Chrétien government, introduced sweeping changes to transfers to provinces and territories. I spent roughly the first 10 years of my career rebuilding that fiscal architecture, if you will, of transfers to provinces and territories. Fiscal sustainability is not a partisan issue. Nobody's agenda gets carried if you hit the fiscal wall. So I don't actually see measures that support fiscal sustainability as being partisan in any way. And so, I think that's an anchor for me on the personal level. I will just point quickly to not chew into your time, to my role in the 2008-2009 global recession. I was at Industry Canada at the time, and I was Director General of Strategic Policy, where I was stick handling some 23 projects to report back in terms of implementation. And it was because we had the fiscal room at the time that Canada was able to come out of that recession more cleanly and clearly than other countries. So, I think just from any number of parts of my career, I can assure you that I stand for fiscal sustainability and execution, implementation, and a quality of analysis to support decision making.
Thank you. And most recently, you've been working for FinTrack. And that's another topic that we discussed quite extensively here at committee. So we know that FinTrack has been tracking and reporting, and we're having increasing fraud and all types of activities around the world. Can you just elaborate on how those experiences will help you in your PBO role, or if there's an overlapping connection that's going to help you out?
For sure, and I think the common thread all the way through is the question of following the money. So for the last 6.5 years at FinTrack, I've led the research group, international work, policy work, and so on, towards that question of, how do you follow money of bad folks doing bad things? And, really that's been essentially the common denominator throughout my career, either following the money, Ottawa, across the provinces, for the budget to the estimates process, through productivity issues and support to business, the employment insurance program. It's all a question of what money is flowing, to what end, and what are the decision points and turning points that decision makers need to be aware of. So I kind of see it all as a one piece, but I'm happy to follow up if that wasn't where you were going with that.
No, I think I just wanted to see what the overlap would have been in that role, and now entering this role here. The other question I would have for you today is, in terms of the changing economic landscape that we're going through right now, with the war in Iran and trade war with the U.S.,
I'm
it's
sorry,
a very...
Mr. McDonald, that's your time.
Oh, I'll have time
you'll
again.
have to, do it again sometime. Monsieur Garon va continuer avec vous pour 2 minutes et demie.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ryan, I'd like to come back on that because I find it
Crap, the translator's like eating the
important.
mic.
I know that you're at a stage in your career where you still have quite a few years where you can serve with competence and skill. But when you look at the previous PBOs, Mr. Fréchette, Mr. Page, Mr. Giroux, and Mr. Jakes, who will probably stay with the office, I believe, none of them returned to work for the federal government. And upon reflection, perhaps you don't want to serve a second mandate because you'll have done your work. But if you go back to work in government, which you may have criticized before, and there's Bill C-290 on whistleblowers, and apparently whistleblowers are not treated very well by the system. I'm just wondering whether this might undermine the independence of, or rather, it might be a good idea to require of any PBO not to go back to the federal public service, or at least to go back after a cooling off period. Well, that's an excellent question. Yes, well, that's why I'm asking it. Well, honestly, I never considered that before coming here today, and I would rather think before speaking. But you did think about only serving one term. You put that in your opening remarks. Yes, that's right. Maybe after a cooling off period, there was a study on fiscal federalism. Well, since I'm an expert in that field, I might want to work for the government again. Quickly, you worked for Minister Champagne. You might be PBO in 3 weeks. Would you feel at ease criticizing a policy you worked on 3 weeks ago? Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Garon.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ryan, I like one of the comments that you made at the beginning, where you said that it is your intention to make an analysis that is well understood by the public. And I particularly paid attention to that because, of course, we are in a scenario where you have two different accounting practices being used by the government. We have the budget that was presented, Budget 2025, which had used a completely new set of definitions for operating expenses, definitions that have not been used anywhere else. The previous Parliamentary Budget Officer, as I'm sure you know, called them overly expensive and called for an independent expert body to police the numbers because of the magnitude of operating expenses that were being shifted from operating to capital in about $94 billion. And of course, now we have the main estimates. So the main estimates submitted to Parliament, those use a different set of definitions. Nobody has the time to reconcile because the reconciliation is meant to be, or the only way to do it is manual, and it's complicated. And so do you then believe that it is acceptable for a country to use two different sets of books, one for, the ones that Canadians pay attention to for the headlines and one for Parliament?
So the way that I view the government's statement about its plans for operating budget balance, whereas running, a capital budget deficit is something that they'd be more comfortable with for a period of time, I view that as more of a political statement by the government. It's a statement about, in my view, the direction of how they plan to manage the overall fiscal framework going forward. In my reading of the budget, and everything that you just described, I don't see that changing the accounting of federal government in any way. And in particular, it doesn't change the fact that a dollar borrowed has to be paid back, and it has to be paid back with interest. And so, to the extent that the generally accepted accounting principles are going to continue to apply, the PBO is absolutely within its mandate to support parliamentarians with the elaboration of a number of different parliamentary fiscal anchors, if you will. So yeah, let's continue to look at debt to GDP. Let's look at deficits as a share of GDP. Let's look at the measure of how much in revenue is going to debt charges in any given year. And that aspect of having a number of different measures and looking at a number of different scenarios, I think will give a lot more clarity to Parliament about, as the government steers through its plans to rebuild infrastructure and defense and so on, does it remain affordable under different scenarios, as we've heard earlier, war, interest rates, inflation, oil prices. Let's work it through and see where it takes us. And if it's going in the wrong direction, then let me help you put those constraints around the government.
So, in your words, the budget is more of a political statement, a political paper, and you have a government that ran on a slogan of spend less, invest more, but then you change, when Canadians are not looking, then you change definitions to reallocate $94 billion from expenses to investments. Would you agree that that's just for political reasons then? There's no real benefit to the country in doing that, especially when you end up with two different accounting principles being used.
So to be clear, I don't think political statements are necessarily bad things. And I don't think that the statement that the government is going to, from an accounting or algebraic or mathematical sense, follow how they're going to pull back in operating spending to make space for greater capital spending. That is consistent with spend less to invest more. It's simply bringing greater clarity to what they mean by that. So
Thank you, Ms. Ryan. That's time for this round. Thank you, Ms. Kobina. We will continue now with Mr. Sawatsky for 5 minutes.
Chair, and thank you, Ms. Ryan, for coming here today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank Interim PBO Mr. Jakes for his work. So just maybe if you could elaborate a bit on your experience in public service. How do you think your government-wide experience will contribute to fulfilling your role as PBO?
I would very much like to
this
help
in her opening
Parliament
statements,
to hold the government's feet to the fire to make sure that the announcements that they make in budget are both affordable and that they will be executed. And I would offer that my 3 decades of public service prepare me very well for this. I've worked in all 3 central agencies. I've done economic policy at Industry Canada, social policy at ESDC, national security policy, and banking policy. I have written many of the binders that ministers and deputies show up at committees with. I know the questions that they prefer that you ask them. I know the questions that they prefer you not ask them. And I would like to, build out the role of PBO to make sure that you have before you the options to ask a wider set of questions to the government to make sure that things are moving in the right track. And that's how I think my experience can be put to the use of Parliament.
Thank you very much. I'm just kind of looking through some of the past experiences. I see here, founding board member, PEI Alliance for Mental Wellbeing. This is an area that I think is quite important. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit to your work as a founding board member.
For sure. This one is this one's personal. I will say that during the pandemic, my nephew was killed by an impaired driver, and as part of honoring his legacy, I was in touch with different folks in the province. I also know the premier at the time, and looking at the strains that are on communities right now, urban, rural, what have you. Those strains in terms of mental health and addictions and so on, they show the strains in communities right now. And the raison d'etre for this group was to try and get supports to individuals, families, communities before their mental health or addictions pressures got them into the red zone. So, that was the raison d'etre for that group and my reason for joining. I will say that I cleared it with all of our relevant ethics and values and ethics people to make sure there was no conflict of interest before doing that on a volunteer basis. And we organized an inaugural national summit on alcohol use that I think was fundamental in kind of tabling some new issues and helping to think, are we on the right track with that?
Thank you very much for sharing. That's a very impactful story, and I'm very, very happy to hear that it made some impact. Just maybe coming to another one of your experiences here as Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Financial Policy of Finance Canada. If you could maybe just speak to what was some of your day-to-day work in that role, as well as how that might give you some experience as the PBO.
Certainly. So in that role, which I held for about 2.5 years, I supported the government with advice on different matters relevant to financial sector policy. During those times, I led in terms of cybersecurity issues for the financial sector, including some of the earliest serious cyber incidents at BMO Simply and at Desjardins. I also led on anti-money laundering policy, which I then followed into FinTrack on an operational basis as my current role. I worked on the negotiation of the CUSMA chapter related to financial sector policy. So I think that, the aspect of understanding well the financial sector in terms of how regulation affects their ability to lend to businesses, consumers in a much more up-close way is also something that I would take into the role of Parliamentary Budget Officer.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Ryan. Thank you, Mr. Sawatsky. We will continue now with Mr. Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you. In response to you were questioned earlier about the role of the PBO in communicating budget items, and your predecessor used some very strong, forceful, not profane in that sense, but strong, forceful language to discuss and to communicate the state of Canada's public finances. It appears to many that this was a contributing factor to his not being here at the table and you being here as an alternative nominee. Will you have? How do you feel about the need to be clear? And sometimes clarity and honesty requires strong, forceful language. So I'd like you to maybe expand on that, if you may, about the way your office communicates the challenges that Canada faces with its finances.
So let me say that I think that there is a way to communicate the gravity of a circumstance with the analysis. So, in the 1990s, when Canada was coming up towards that fiscal cliff, there were escalating dynamics that saw those debt charges ramping up. I think that one can do the math and put the numbers before parliamentarians and paint the picture of a worsening fiscal situation, particularly if it differs from the way that the government is presenting a fiscal situation. That will absolutely be clear, and the implications of that situation will be clear. And as I said earlier, I think it's up to the parliamentarians to apply the stark language. And I would also say that Jason Jakes led the adoption of a communications policy within the PBO, as was recommended by the OECD report that people like to reference, to say that neutrality and of language is important for the role.
Now you mentioned the fiscal situation in the 90s a couple of times now. And Mr. Jakes talked about that too. It was his view that this was at a meeting this was just in September, just before, at the beginning of his appointment as an interim PBO. He said that with the federal debt to GDP ratio forecast to increase, if we don't change things, we are going to end up there again. This was in talking about the 1990s. We're going to end up there again if things don't change. Do you agree with Mr. Jakes that the current finances of the country are unsustainable and are leading us to the same situation in the 1990s if things don't change?
So I think that Jason himself provided a different view of his remarks in December of 2025 when he said that language was not appropriate and that, in fact, the fiscal track was sustainable. I also think that there's different ways that he could have looked at what track he was looking at. And
we got a minute left.
Okay, sorry.
I really wanted your view.
Mm-hmm.
His point was that the debt to GDP ratio is rising, and do you think that a rising debt to GDP ratio is sustainable?
A rising debt to GDP ratio
Yes.
is of concern. The level of that debt to GDP ratio also has to be considered to decide whether it's sustainable or not. Not just Jason himself, but other voices like the IMF and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation have said that the current debt tracks are sustainable. I look forward to seeing the models of the PBO that would contribute to a view that they are unsustainable, but I don't think even the PBO is there at this point in time.
Mr. Jakes was in his testimony was pretty clear, but let's talk about, if we have time, All right, lapsed funding. How does that? You talked about executable policy. When funds lapse, that's non-execution. Any views on that?
Absolutely, I do.
You don't have time to share them at this moment, but maybe someone else will ask you about it and you'll have an opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Mr. Turnbull for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Ms. Ryan, for being here today. I note that the process was quite broad and competitive that brought you to us today, so congratulations on being here and making it this far. and it's great to have you before committee to talk about your experience. Before I turn it over, I want to share my time with my colleague Steve Lavoie, but I wanted to correct the record on something that I've heard from opposition members numerous times. There is precedent for an interim PBO, and we thank Jason Jacks for serving in that capacity. And I know that he's spent 16 years in the PBO and did remarkable work and continued to, to do that in the role of interim PBO. But in, 2013, March to September, there was an interim PBO when Kevin Page stepped down under Prime Minister Harper. And so roughly a 6-month time period. Interim PBOs are not unheard of. There is a limit to the time period. And again, we thank Jason Jacks for having done the role in the interim while the process was underway to search out and find the next permanent PBO. And so I'll hand it over to Mr. Lavoie to ask some questions.
Merci beaucoup, cher collègue.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Ryan, for being with us today. I'd like to follow up on a question put by Mr. Detaille with regard to precision. I worked in banking for 20 years, and I spoke with some colleagues who now are tearing their hair out because there's no predictability. And companies need predictability to flourish. I worked and we've had witnesses here, and it seems that predictability is something that's gone out the window. You have 30 years of experience. There's a lot of uncertainty in the markets today. So how are you going to integrate that uncertainty in your analyses, knowing that in the last 30 years, it probably wasn't as necessary to include as many variables in your calculations, but that has changed. So how are you going to take this uncertainty into account in your analyses? Thank you for the question. I'll start with a brief anecdote from the beginning of my career when I was working on forecast for for equalization. I worked on the numbers, and the only thing that I recall from that time is that uncertainty is part and parcel of forecasting and estimates. I think that it's important to develop different budgetary scenarios to put caps or thresholds on certain periods of time in assessing the consequences of a budget. So I think that's one way of helping us to see whether our decisions are sustainable or not. Quickly, what are your 5 priorities? Often we talk about the 91st days. I'm not going to ask for details, but for the average Canadian, what are your 5 priorities? Well, one is sustainability of the budgetary cycle. And the second is holding the government's feet to the fire when it comes to its commitments to programs and projects that they announced in the last budget. And so what's your timetable on those 2 priorities? Well, we can start working on the questions right away, but our work with Parliament is ongoing. In 20 seconds. For my citizens in Beauport, Limoilou, why is the independence of your office so important? There are 40 employees at the Parliamentary Budget Office. There are 369 federal public servants. Thank you. We'll continue with Mr. Garon for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll follow up on Mr. Lavoie's question. People in my riding of Mirabel work in teams, and often the teams don't change much. You have a team, and when a new parliamentary budget officer arrives, there might be a different way of working, a different style of work. And we know that the PBO works with the opposition. We have fewer resources than the government, which you know. But in the past with Mr. Jakes, or rather, how are things going to change compared to how Mr. Jakes ran the office? What can we expect from you that'll be different? Well, I want to move incrementally. I want to look at the models that they've built. I want to see what their priorities are. I'm going to listen to parliamentarians. And so I don't think you'll see any big changes right away. By the fall, I intend to put my stamp on the role and to implement the 2 priorities I mentioned earlier to Mr. Lavoie. Mr. Jakes will still work for the office. He'll still be working with you. How do you see his role? How are you going to work with him? Have you thought about that? I've known Jason for over 20 years. I also know the other senior officials in the PBO. It's a matter of maintaining the respect and collegiality we've had because we are professionals. The fact that Mr. Jakes was the interim PBO, does that give him any special expertise? What's it going to be like when you come on board? Well, I read Jason's testimony before OGO and other committees, and he said he was looking forward to work with the next PBO. I think we'll be taking the same approach. That's what you do when you take on a new job. Thank you very much.
Mr. Halan for 5 minutes.
Ms. Ryan, at the time of the Budget 2025 report, the PBO at the time raised concerns about the government's abandoning of fiscal anchors such as the declining debt-to-GDP ratio. As an economist yourself, do you share those concerns that the absence of fiscal anchors increases fiscal risk?
I do share the concern that it's utterly important to keep eyes on fiscal sustainability, debt levels, deficit levels. I think that what Jason surfaced was a concern that the levels of that deficit track were taking a marked step up from what they had previously been. I think that the discussion since that time has reached something of a consensus, not everybody, that that track is sustainable. I think there remains a concern that if we were to see future jumps up, future stepwise increases in those debt and deficit levels, that...
With all due respect, Ms. Ryan, they jump up every single time under this government. The amount of spending just currently now, the government is adding another $60 billion to that. So in other words, it is going to jump up. But again, my question was about the fiscal anchors being abandoned. Is that not a risk financially for the country?
I agree that that is a risk. And I also would go back to my remarks earlier to say that the Parliamentary Budget Office has a clear role in accountability for the government to track the implications of those spending increases through time and continue to hold their feet to the fire to say what is happening in terms of debt to GDP and so on.
I appreciate that, because that's exactly what's happening, as it always does. I mean, the increase in the deficit now, even after that budget was tabled, is about $60 billion more. The PBO also reported that any increased spending and those lack of the fiscal anchors like we're seeing leaves little to no room to respond to economic shocks. We all know what's going on around the world. Would you share those same concerns?
I share the view that it's important to leave fiscal room to deal with shocks. I think that there remains room in the current track to deal with shocks. I also think that it's not a contradiction to say that it's important to keep eyes on that track to make sure that that buffer remains.
Well, right now, the deficit from that budget was about $78 billion. As we know, it was double of what Justin Trudeau's economic update was at the time. The government is notorious, as we know, for adding more spending every year, which likely means deficit projections will be higher than projected. That's just a track record. At the time, the PBO projects deficits around, as I said, $60 billion over the next 5 years. At a time of what we're going through right now, which seems like economic stagnation, weak productivity, would you characterize the $60 billion plus deficit as fiscally responsible right now?
I think that it is sustainable. I think that...
Is it fiscally responsible, though?
I think that...
I mean, we can all sustain a certain amount of money, but is it responsible?
I think there's room for that track to be responsible. So...
what would you consider responsible spending?
So the views that give the view that the criteria that give a view that that's a responsible track are things like Canada maintains its AAA bond rating right now. The debt to GDP ratio that Canada has, while it may increase from its 42 and change percent of GDP right now, it is on a track to go down to 39 into the medium term. I also think that the view of the IMF, which recently reviewed Canada, was that there remains fiscal room. So for a number of reasons, just briefly, I think that there remains room to deal with different shocks. I think that it's worth testing how much room there is, and I think that the PBO can absolutely conduct that type of scenario analysis of at what point are we going to get into deeper trouble.
At the same time, sorry to cut you off.
Thank you, Mr. Halan. That's 5 minutes. Thank you, Ms. Ryan. We will continue now with Mr. Littau.
Très bien. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, here we are for a second round. Thank you very much. In fact, I share your opinion with regard to the sustainability of Canada's finances. We always have to look at these issues in the context of the present moment, which right now is very chaotic. And you can't separate these two things. But where I'd like to go might surprise you. Canada is a federation, a very decentralized federation. I might exaggerate, but maybe not a bit. Maybe 5 people in Canada really understand the mechanism of federal transfers, and you are one of these 5 people. So it's obviously these federal transfers are very complex, as is equalization. So will you analyze not only budgets and their sustainability, their long-term fiscal sustainability, but will you also provide information to parliamentarians and Canadians on the complexity of these system, which may seem difficult to understand, but which is essential to the good functioning of our federation. Do you feel that PBO has a role in that regard? Because issues related to this will surely arise quickly. I agree with you on the complexity, which is everywhere right now, and that this represents a challenge for parliamentarians. That is to frame debate on issues relevant to Canadians. Fiscal analysis in and of itself is a complex undertaking, and I feel that the role of the PBO is to take these complex sectors and to find decision points. And risk points, to put those before parliamentarians and setting aside the complexity. As well, I feel that the complexity of government stands in the way of the implementation of programs, and it's important that parliamentarians be in a good position to ask questions of officials and ministers when they take into account the complexities and risks, and not only points of communication. Yes, indeed, because Canada still has a very good credit rating. As a whole, Canada and Canada's credit rating and the credit rating of all the provinces affects the financial situation and sustainability of the country, and that's why transfer payments are very important. As parliamentarians, it's important for us to understand the different areas of jurisdiction. Provinces are responsible for some areas, and the federal government is responsible for other areas. It's complicated here in Canada, but on the other hand, it works. And in fact, I think it works pretty well. But we always have to keep in mind existing risks and the necessity for all of us to speak with each other, different levels of government. And I think that you, with your experience in the federal public service, but also in a provincial public service, you understand these issues very well, and you will be able to shed a new light on these matters. Thank you, Mr. Letao. Your time is up. We'll continue with Mr. Lefebvre for 5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ryan, a little earlier, my colleagues on the other side asked you a question in English about the deficit of $78 billion. For you, is that a responsible thing? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I will answer that. I don't see the difference between reasonable and sustainable. You don't see a difference between reasonable and sustainable? For you, it's the same thing? I believe that the issue of sustainability relates to the right level of taxation, and that is an issue for parliamentarians to discuss. It's a reasonable issue for parliamentarians to discuss. As I said before, sustainability is not a partisan matter. As long as we stay in the framework of sustainability, we can have reasonable debates amongst parliamentarians. What do you think of the budgetary balance? What do you mean? I mean that the government should present a balanced budget. I believe that the government has a certain latitude to present its finances and to tell parliamentarians and Canadians how their money will be spent. This government has rather described the direction in which they will be moving. They said they will spend less here and invest more there. I think it's possible to do that for a while. There is room to operate in that kind of framework. Mr. Jakes said this as well, so I think it's a reasonable issue to debate for parliamentarians. Let me stop you here. I'll quote a former Minister of Finance of Quebec for whom I have a high degree of respect, Mr. Latayo. He said that budgetary balance for him was not an obligation, it was an obsession for him. What do you think of that quote? That balancing the budget should not only be an obligation, but an obsession for a Minister of Finance. Would you agree with that? Well, I don't think it should be an obsession. So for you, a deficit of $700 million 10 years ago to over $1 billion today, you're mortgaging the future of our children and grandchildren. Are you at ease with that? Well, as I said before when I answered the question on sustainability, I think it is advantageous to have smaller debts and deficits for future generations to deal with. The position of the government is that it is investing to bolster the economy, create jobs, and increase revenues for future years. And respectfully, I believe it's up to you to decide whether that's the right thing or not. I'll ask my question again. $700 million in debt 10 years ago to $1.3 billion in debt today. You're comfortable with that? As long as the fiscal framework, the current fiscal framework, has expenses of 11 cents on the dollar and does not put undue pressure on the dollar, I think it is something that's fine. So you think it's fine to increase the size of government by increasing the debt on Canadians? You think that's fine? Well, if you ask me, as Mr. Kelly described, whether the debt growing is a good thing or not, well, that's a different matter. Thank you, Ms. Ryan, and thank you, Mr. Lefebvre.
Agreement between the parties that we will have one more round from the Liberals and one more round from the Bloc. So I will turn it over to Mr. MacDonald for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Ryan, we were getting to your answer on a question that's quite a few minutes ago now. But what we were talking about was Parliament's understanding of fiscal issues and the economic landscape that we're under right now. And I think I referenced the Iran war and oil prices and the trade wars with the U.S. How do you feel the PBO's role will play into advising parliamentarians of probably policy changes we're going to have to make quicker than we ever have before? Do you have any advice on that? Or
So I think that there will be many questions that are truly within the realm of parliamentarians to decide. And some of those can be informed by economic analysis, budgetary analysis, and others not. You know, if you take the case of the Iran war, let's go back to the start of the Parliamentary Budget Office in 2008, where one of the questions of the day was whether the government should insert itself into the conflict in Afghanistan. At the time, the government was saying that the cost of that would be in the order of 8 or 9 billion, and the Parliamentary Budget Officer of the day, Kevin Page, said, it's up to you, Parliament, to decide whether to engage our military in this conflict. Respectfully, our analysis is that the cost will be much more like $19–20 billion. I think that that is a good example of the type of questions, where elements of a decision are not appropriate for a PBO to weigh in on, the diplomatic, military, considerations of a decision like that. But if there are big questions where there should be attention paid to whether the government's estimates are correct, or whether there would be unintended consequences, whether there are risks that the government either hasn't foreseen or hasn't been transparent about. I think that the PBO can absolutely be a support to parliamentarians for those type of questions that are going to come with the very uncertain and volatile world that faces Canada.
Just another line of questioning. I've kind of been intrigued by the way parliamentary budget officers have become a household name in the past 2 decades. And that probably wasn't the case or the intention starting out. In the role of parliamentary budget officer is to be impartial and to make analysis of government decisions to help overall Canadians understand, parliamentarians understand our fiscal position. Would you like to comment on, will everyone know who Miss Ryan is in 7 years? Or, in my opinion, we shouldn't know who Miss Ryan is. We should know what her analysis is. We should be able to read the analysis, and that should be the message that's left with us. I'd just like your opinion on that.
What was the?
I think that the
I don't get the
legislation
question.
of the Parliament to Canada Act is clear that the role of the PBO is to support the quality of parliamentary debate, for example, by providing macroeconomic or budgetary forecasts. I see the PBO as supporting parliamentarians. The Parliamentary Budget Officer should not lead the debate, but rather support the debate. I will step forward and explain analysis. I will ask the tough questions. I will do the pointy homework to support those debates. I don't have a view of where I should be in people's radar. I'm happy to step forward and explain things if they need explaining. Also happy to let the work speak for itself, and I think that's how I would approach your question.
I have about 20 seconds left.
Quickly, will an average Canadian understand your analysis, or?
That's the goal that I've had my whole career.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. MacDonald. On va conclure avec...
We will conclude with Mr. Garon, 2 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Letao presented you as one of the 5 people who knew the best in Canada the transfer system, and I have no doubt that you have this expertise, which means you also know provincial finances as well. Would you say that today's Quebec's finances is sustainable? I haven't had a look at Quebec's financial framework. So you're not among the 5th people who know the best Quebec's finances. So we have a government over the past years, a government that has worked in Quebec's jurisdiction. What do you think about the use of the federal power to spend? You've talked about fiscal federalism earlier, so what do you think about it? Is it a good power? Should it be framed? I bring this back to the discussion we had with Mr. McDonald. For example, if we go to war, it's an economic issue. It has to do with the budget. So if we come back to what you said about Afghanistan, the federal government decided to use its power to get into the province's jurisdiction, and as your role as an observer, if we ask you how much it's going to be costing the whole thing, you will do it, but you will never give an opinion on the federal's powers. Is that do I understand you well? I think this is up to you to discuss with your colleagues. If you want the office to help you, so would you be ready to be reticent to see the government work in the province's jurisdictions? You only have a couple of seconds. I'm okay with giving you any analysis you need. Thank you very much.
To conclude this study, this conversation that we're having with Ms. Ryan, I just want to confirm that. So unless there are any objections, we will end the rounds of questioning there. Great, thank you. On behalf of the committee, Ms. Ryan, I would like to thank you very much for your time today and for answering all of these questions. Before we conclude the meeting, however, there are 3 budgets that have been sent around.
Okay, so now they're just doing some committee business. We basically, we're done with Annette. Yeah, like I said in chat, I think she's pretty liberal. Just the way that she's definitely being given some PR training over the years on how to avoid questions in like a third person and like not directly answering questions that she might have an opinion on. Because she was very hesitant and like evasive on giving her direct opinion on just basic questions like debt to GDP ratio. If that's rising, is that bad? She's like, well, and then she takes you down this word salad. It's like a typical liberal response. Yeah, she's very liberal. Yeah, I think so. But that is it for today. There are some committees on in the morning, but nothing. It's all boring crap. There's nothing that we're going to cover in the morning. We'll do a question period like normal at 2 p.m. And then after, we've got 2 committees that we can cover in the afternoon. So we'll catch Gary Chipmunk in the Security Committee for an hour, and then we'll swap over to listening to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation guy Franco in the Environment Committee while they're talking about industrial carbon pricing. So we'll have about 2 hours of committee, 1 hour of question period. We'll be live about 3 hours tomorrow. And that'll be it for tomorrow. So, yeah. Thank you, Wee Cookie, for the super chat. Really appreciate you. And thanks, Hubris. I think I caught you on the last one. You're joining the club just popped up again on this chat. So, and thanks, everyone, for tuning in and watching. Have a great rest of your evening. I'll see you guys tomorrow. See you guys. Bye-bye.